Hey everyone, welcome back to our chapter book read-along of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief by Riordan. We are reading this super awesome illustrated copy of the book that is illustrated by John Rocco. And I am so excited to continue the story. It is starting to get, very intense. What I want to do is if you are reading this with someone, pause the video and talk about some of the things you remember from our story so far. So, what has happened in the first 4 chapters? What are some of our main characters? What is maybe your favorite part so far? And then, here goes my review. Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, is about Percy Jackson. He has started at a school called Yancey Academy. Now, when we start this story, Percy and his friend Grover are on a field trip. There's our characters. They are on a field trip to the art museum. Well, it starts off generally normal until Percy gets in trouble. And the teacher who is there with him, Mrs. Dodds, takes him back into the museum to give him a talking to. Well, it was a little bit more than a talking to, because Mrs. Dodds turned into a terrifying monster. She had wings, her eyes glowed, she had talons, and was going to attack Percy. Now, Mr. Brunner, his other teacher, came on in and tossed him a pen that turned into a sword. Percy sliced through his algebra teacher, and she turned into dust. Now, the even more weird thing about this situation is that afterwards, everyone pretended that Mrs. Dodds didn't exist. They were convinced that she had never even been at their school. It very much confused Percy, and he did know that something was up because his friend Grover could not keep that lie going. Now, Percy overheard Mr. Brunner and Grover talking right before the end of the school year. Percy heard Grover telling Mr. Brunner he was worried about Percy. He thought he was going to be attacked again. And that the summer equinox deadline is coming up. Wonder what that means. Well, we then find Percy and Grover riding a bus back to New York City at the end of their school year. Percy and Grover's bus breaks down at one point. They have to hop out. And across the road is 3 old ladies knitting, the socks of death is what Percy called them, but the biggest electric blue socks Percy had ever seen. They looked directly at Percy and snipped the cord. He could hear it all the way across that traffic. It scared the heck out of Grover. And so Grover was very nervous the whole rest of the drive. Well, it also made Percy nervous, so he kind of ditched him on his way to his mom's. Percy's mother's name is Sally, and she is a wonderful person who's married to a not so wonderful person. His name is Smelly Gabe, and he is just kind of rude to Sally and Percy and always just asking them to do stuff or asking for money. Not very nice guy. Well, Sally and Percy go to their favorite spot in the world, a little cabin on the ocean for a vacation, celebrating that Percy is back. While at the cabin, a huge storm happens. And then someone knocks on the door in the middle of the storm. It's Grover. But he looks a little different. From the waist down, he has goat legs. What? And he says that Percy is in grave danger. Percy, his mom, and Grover all jump into the car and start speeding down the highway, all the way to what they are calling Camp Half-Blood. Now, Percy's trying to figure out why his best friend looks half barnyard animal, and Grover tells him he's a satyr. He is supposed to protect Percy and be there to guide him to Camp Half-Blood. Well, almost there. They're so close, and the car gets struck by lightning. Whew, scary stuff. And then they are attacked by a creature called a minotaur. It is a half bull, half man. Weird. This is once again another creature from Greek mythology. Not real, luckily, because he is angry and very strong. He grabs Percy's mom and she disintegrates into gold light. It's very scary to Percy because he doesn't know where his mother went. And then Percy defeats him by ripping off one of his horns and getting him with it. So Grover and Percy make their way up to the camp and to the big house, where we see our heroes again as our chapters continue. So let's get going with more of The Lightning Thief. Chapter 5. I play pinochle with a horse. I had weird dreams full of barnyard animals. Most of them wanted to kill me. The rest wanted food. I must have woken up several times, but what I heard and saw made no sense. So I just passed out again. I remember lying in a soft bed, being spoon-fed something that tasted like buttered popcorn, only it was pudding. The girl with curly blonde hair hovered over me, smirking as she scraped drips off my chin with the spoon. When she saw my eyes open, she asked, "What will happen at the summer solstice?" I managed to croak, "What?" She looked around, as if afraid someone would overhear. "What's going on? What was stolen? We've only got a few weeks." "I'm sorry," I mumbled. "I don't." Somebody knocked on the door, and the girl quickly filled my mouth with pudding. The next time I woke up, the girl was gone. A husky blonde dude, like a surfer, stood in the corner of the bedroom, keeping watch over me. He had blue eyes, at least a dozen of them, on his cheeks, his forehead, the backs of his hands. When I finally came around for good, there was nothing weird about my surroundings, except that they were nicer than what I was used to. I was sitting on a deck chair on a huge porch, gazing across the meadow at green hills in the distance. The breeze smelled like strawberries. There was a blanket over my legs, a pillow behind my neck. All that was great, but my mouth felt like a scorpion had been using it for a nest. My tongue was dry and nasty, and every one of my teeth hurt. On the table next to me was a tall drink. It looked like iced apple juice, with a green straw and a paper parasol stuck through a maraschino cherry. My hand was so weak I almost dropped the glass once my fingers got around it. "Careful," a familiar voice said. Grover was leaning against the porch railing, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Under one arm he cradled a shoebox. He was wearing blue jeans, Converse high tops, and a bright orange t-shirt that said, "Camp Half-Blood." Just plain old Grover, not the goat boy. So maybe I'd had a nightmare. Maybe my mom was okay. We were still on vacation, and we'd stopped here at this big house for some reason, and... "You saved my life," Grover said. Well, the least I could do. I went back to the hill. I thought you might want this." Reverently, he placed the shoebox in my lap. Inside was a black and white bull's horn, the base jagged from being broken off, the tip splattered with dried blood. It hadn't been a nightmare. "The Minotaur," I said. Percy, it isn't a good idea." "That's what they call him in Greek myths, isn't it?" I demanded. "The Minotaur, half man, half bull." Grover shifted uncomfortably. "You've been out for 2 days. How much do you remember?" "My mom. Is she really—" He looked down. I stared across the meadow. There were groves of trees, a winding stream, acres of strawberries spread out under the blue sky. The valley was surrounded by rolling hills, and the tallest one, directly in front of us, was the one with the huge pine tree at the top. Even that looked beautiful in the sunlight. My mother was gone. The whole world should be black and cold. Nothing should look beautiful. "I'm sorry," Grover sniffed. "I'm a failure. I'm the worst satyr in the world." He moaned, stomping on his foot so hard it came off. The Converse high top came off. The inside was filled with styrofoam, except for a hoof-shaped shoe. "Oh, sticks!" he mumbled. Thunder rolled across the clear sky. As he struggled to get his hoof back in the fake foot, I thought, well, that settles it. Grover was a satyr. I was ready to bet that if I shaved his curly brown hair, I'd find tiny horns on his head. But I was too miserable to care that satyrs existed, or even minotaurs. All that meant was that my mom was really squeezed into nothingness, dissolved into yellow light. I was alone, an orphan. I would have to live with Smelly Gabe? No, that would never happen. I would live on the streets first. I would pretend I was 17 and join the army. I would do something. Grover was still sniffling. The poor kid, poor goat, satyr, whatever, looked as if he expected to be hit. I said, "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was. I was supposed to protect you." "Did my mother ask you to protect me?" "No, but that's my job. I'm a keeper. At least I was." "But why?" I suddenly felt dizzy, my vision swimming. "Don't strain yourself," Grover said. "Here." He helped me hold my glass and put the straw to my lips. I recoiled at the taste, because I was expecting apple juice. It wasn't at all. It was chocolate chip cookies. Liquid cookies. And not just any cookies. My mom's homemade blue chocolate chip cookies. Buttery and hot. With the chips still melting. Drinking it, my whole body felt warm and good. Full of energy. My grief didn't go away. But I felt as if my mom had just brushed her hand against my cheek, given me a cookie the way she used to when I was small, and told me everything was going to be okay. Before I knew it, I drained the glass. I stared into it. Sure, I'd just had a warm drink, but the ice cubes hadn't even melted. "Was it good?" Grover asked. I nodded. "What did it taste like?" He sounded so wistful, I felt guilty. "Sorry," I said. "I should have let you taste." His eyes got wide. No, that's not what I meant. I just wondered." "Chocolate chip cookies," I said. "My mom's. Homemade." He sighed. "And how do you feel?" "Like I could throw Nancy Bobofit 100 yards. "That's good," he said. "That's good. I don't think you could risk drinking any more of that stuff." "What do you mean?" He took the empty glass from me gingerly, as if it were dynamite, and set it back on the table. "Come on. Kyrian and Mr. D are waiting." The porch wrapped all the way around the farmhouse. My legs felt wobbly, trying to walk that far. Grover offered to carry the Minotaur horn, but I held on to it. I'd paid for that souvenir the hard way. I wasn't going to let it go. As soon as we came around to the opposite end of the house, I caught my breath. We must have been on the north shore of Long Island, because on this side of the house, the valley marched all the way up to the water, which glittered about a mile in the distance. Between here and there, I simply couldn't process everything I was seeing. The landscape was dotted with buildings that looked like Greek architecture. An open-air pavilion, an amphitheater, a circular arena, except that they all looked brand new, their white marble columns sparkling in the sun. In a nearby sand pit, a dozen high school-age kids and satyrs played volleyball. Canoes glided across a small lake. Kids in bright orange t-shirts like Grover's were chasing each other around a cluster of cabins nestled in the woods. Some shot targets at an archery range. Others rode horses down a wooded trail. And, unless I was hallucinating, some of their horses had wings. Down at the end of the porch, two men sat across from each other at a card table. The blonde-haired girl who'd spoon-fed me popcorn-flavored pudding was leaning on the porch rail next to them. The man facing me was small, but porky. He had a red nose, big watery eyes, and curly hair so black it was almost purple. He looked like those paintings of baby angels. What do you call them? Hubbubs? No, cherubs, that's it. He looked like a cherub who'd turned middle-aged in a trailer park. He wore a tiger-patterned Hawaiian shirt, and he would have fit right in at one of Gabe's power parties, except I got the feeling this guy could have outgambled even my stepfather. "That's Mr. D," Grover murmured to me. "He's the camp director. Be polite. The girl, that's Annabeth Chase. She's just a camper, but she's been here longer than just about anybody. And you already know Kyrian." He pointed at the guy whose back was to me. First, I realized he was sitting in the wheelchair. Then I recognized the tweed jacket, the thinning brown hair, and the scraggly beard. "Mr. Brunner!" I cried. The Latin teacher turned and smiled at me. His eyes had that mischievous glint they sometimes got in class when he pulled a pop quiz and made all the multiple choice answers B. "Ah, good, Percy," he said. "Now we have 4 for Pinochle." He offered me a chair to the right of Mr. D, who looked at me with bloodshot eyes and heaved a great sigh. "Oh, I suppose I must say it. Welcome to Camp Half-Blood. There, now, don't expect me to be glad to see you." Thanks? I scooted a little farther away from him because if there was one thing I had learned from living with Gabe, it was to know when an adult has been hitting the happy juice. If Mr. D was a stranger to alcohol, then I was a satyr. "Annabeth," Mr. Brunner called to the blonde girl. She came forward, and Mr. Brunner introduced us. "This young lady nursed you back to health, Percy. Annabeth, my dear, why don't you go and check on Percy's bunk? We'll be putting him in cabin 11 for now." Annabeth said, "Sure, Kyrian." She was probably my age, maybe a couple of inches taller, and a whole lot more athletic looking. With her deep tan and her curly blonde hair, she was almost exactly what I thought a stereotypical California girl would look like. Except her eyes ruined the image. They were startlingly gray, like storm clouds, pretty, but intimidating too, as if she were analyzing the best way to take me down in a fight. She glanced at the minotaur horn in my hands, then looked back at me. I imagined she was going to say, "You killed the minotaur?" or "Wow, you're so awesome," or something like that. Instead, she said, "You drool when you sleep." Then she sprinted off down the lawn, her blonde hair flying behind her. "So," I said, anxious to change the subject, "you, work here, Mr. Brunner?" "Not Mr. Brunner," the ex-Mr. Brunner said. "I'm afraid that was a pseudonym. You may call me Kyrian." Okay, really confused. I looked at the director. "And Mr. D, does that stand for something?" Mr. D stopped shuffling the cards. He looked at me like I'd just belched loudly. "Young man, names are powerful things. You don't just go around using them for no reason." "Oh, right. Sorry." "I must say, Percy," Kyrian Brunner broke in, "I'm glad to see you alive. It's been a long time since I've made a house call to a potential camper. I'd hate to think I've wasted my time." "House call?" "My year at Yancey Academy, to instruct you. We have satyrs at most schools, of course, keeping a lookout, but Grover alerted me as soon as he met you. He sensed that you were something special, so I decided to come upstate. I convinced the other Latin teacher to, take a leave of absence." I tried to remember the beginning of the school year. It seemed like so long ago. But I did have a fuzzy memory of there being another Latin teacher my first week at Yancey. Then, without explanation, he had disappeared, and Mr. Brunner had taken the class. "You came to Yancey just to teach me?" I asked. Kyrian nodded. "Honestly, I wasn't sure about you at first. We contacted your mother, let her know we were keeping an eye on you in case you were ready for Camp Half-Blood. But you still had much to learn. Nevertheless, you made it here alive, and that's always the first test." "Grover," Mr. D said impatiently, "are you playing or not?" "Yes, sir." Grover trembled as he took the 4th chair, although I didn't know why he should be so afraid of a pudgy little man in a tiger print Hawaiian shirt. "You do know how to play pinochle." Mr. D eyed me suspiciously. "I'm afraid not," I said. "I'm afraid not, sir," he said. Sir?" I repeated. I was liking the camp director less and less. Well, he told me, it is, along with gladiator fighting and Pac-Man, one of the greatest games ever invented by humans. I would expect all civilized young men to know the rules. I'm sure the boy can learn, Riordan said. Please, I said, what is this place? What am I doing here? Riordan, why would you go to Yancey Academy just to teach me? Mr. D snorted. I asked the same question. The camp director dealt the cards. Grover flinched every time one landed in his pile. Riordan smiled at me sympathetically, the way he used to in Latin class, as if to let me know that no matter what my average was, I was his star student. He expected me to have the right answer. Percy, he said, did your mother tell you nothing? She said... I remembered her sad eyes, looking out over the sea. She told me she was afraid to send me here, even though my father had wanted her to. She said that once I was here, I probably couldn't leave. She wanted to keep me close to her. Typical, Mr. D said. That's how they usually get killed. Young man, are you bidden or not? What? I asked. He explained impatiently how you bid in pinochle, and so I did. I'm afraid there's too much to tell, Riordan had said. I'm afraid our usual orientation film won't be sufficient. Orientation film? I asked. No, Riordan decided. Well, Percy, you know your friend Grover is a satyr. You know, he pointed to the horn in the shoebox, that you have killed the Minotaur. No small feat either, lad. What you may not know is that great powers are at work in your life. Gods, the forces you call Greek gods, are very much alive. I stared at the others around the table. I waited for somebody to yell, not, but all I got was Mr. D yelling, Oh, a royal marriage, trick, trick, trick! He cackled as he tallied up his points. Mr. D, Grover said timidly, if you're not going to eat it, can I have your Diet Coke can? Oh, all right. Grover bit a huge shard out of the empty aluminum can and chewed it mournfully. Wait, I told Riordan, you're telling me there's such things as God? Well, no, said Riordan. God, capital G God? That's a different matter altogether. I shan't deal with the metaphysical. The metaphysical? But you're just talking about... gods, plural, as in great beings that control the forces of nature and human endeavors. The immortal gods of Olympus. That's a smaller matter. Smaller? Yes, quite. The gods we discussed in Latin class. Zeus, I said, Hera, Apollo, you mean them? And there it was again, a distant thunder on a cloudless day. Young man, said Mr. D, you really should be less casual about throwing those names around, if I were you. But they're stories, I said. They're myths to explain lightning and the seasons and stuff. They're what people believed before there was science. Science, Mr. D scoffed. And tell me, Perseus Jackson. I flinched when he said my real name, which I never told anybody. What will people think of your science 2,000 years from now? Mr. D continued. They will call it primitive mumbo-jumbo. That's what. Oh, I love mortals. They have absolutely no sense of perspective. They think they come so far. And have they, Riordan? Look at this boy and tell me. I wasn't liking Mr. D much, but there was something about the way he called me mortal, as if he wasn't. It was enough to put a lump in my throat. To suggest why Grover was dutifully minding his cards, chewing his soda can, and keeping his mouth shut. Percy, Riordan said, you may choose to believe or not, but the fact is that immortal means immortal. Can you imagine that for a moment never dying, never fading, existing as you are for all time? I was about to answer, off the top of my head, what it sounded like a pretty good deal, But the tone of Kirian's voice made me hesitate. You mean whether people believed in you or not? I said. Exactly, Kirian agreed. If you were a god, how much would you like being called a myth? An old story to explain lightning. What if I told you, Perseus Jackson, that someday people would call you a myth, just created to explain how little boys get over losing their mothers? My heart pounded. He was trying to make me angry for some reason, but I wasn't going to let him. I said, I wouldn't like that, but I don't believe in gods. Oh, you better, Mr. D murmured, before one of them incinerates you. Grover said, Please, sir, he just lost his mother. He's in shock. A lucky thing, too, Mr. D grumbled, playing a card. Bad enough I'm confined to this miserable job, working with boys who don't even believe. He waved his hand, and a goblet appeared on the table, as if the sunlight had bent momentarily and woven air into glass. The goblet filled itself with red wine. My jaw dropped, but Kirian hardly looked up. Mr. D, he warned, your restrictions. Mr. D looked at the wine in feigned surprise. Dear me. He looked at the sky and yelled, Old habits, sorry. More thunder. Mr. D waved his hand again, and the wine glass changed into a fresh can of Diet Coke. He sighed unhappily, popped the top of the soda, and went back to his card game. Kirian winked at me. Mr. D offended his father a while back, took fancy to a wood nymph who had been declared off limits. A wood nymph? I repeated, still staring at the Diet Coke can like it was from outer space. Yes, Mr. D confessed. Father loves to punish me. The first time, prohibition. Ghastly. Absolutely horrid. 10 years. The second time, well, she really was pretty, and I couldn't stay away. The second time, he sent me here. Half-Blood Hill, summer camp for brats like you. Be a better influence, he told me. Work with youths rather than tearing them down. Ha! Absolutely unfair. Mr. D sounded about 6 years old, like a pouting little kid. And, I stammered, your father is? De immortales, Kieran, Mr. D said. I thought you taught this boy the basics. My father is Zeus, of course. I ran through D names from Greek mythology. Wine, the skin of a tiger, satyrs, all that seemed to work here, the way Grover cringed as if Mr. D were his master. You're Dionysus? I said, the god of wine? Mr. D rolled his eyes. Well, what do they say these days, Grover? Do the children say, well, duh? Yes, Mr. D. Then, well, duh, Percy Jackson. Did you think I was Aphrodite, perhaps? You're a god? Yes, child. A god. You? He turned to look me straight on, and I saw a kind of purplish fire in his eyes, a hint that this whiny, plump little man was only showing me the tiniest bit of his true nature. I saw visions of grapevines choking unbelievers to death, drunken warriors insane with battle lust, soldiers screaming as their hands turned to flippers, their faces elongating into dolphin snouts. I knew that if I pushed him, Mr. D would show me worse things. He would plant a disease in my brain that would leave me wearing a straitjacket in a rubber room for the rest of my life. Would you like to test me, child? He said quietly. No, sir. The fire died a little. He turned back to his card game. I believe I win. Not quite, Mr. D, Kirian said. He set down a straight, tallied the points, and said, the game goes to me. I thought Mr. D was going to vaporize Kirian right out of his wheelchair, but he just sighed through his nose as if he were used to being beat by the Latin teacher. He got up, and Grover rose too. I'm tired, Mr. D said. I believe I'll take a nap before the sing-along tonight. But first, Grover, we need to talk, again, about your less than perfect performance on this assignment. Grover's face beaded with sweat. Yes, sir, Mr. D turned to me. Cabin 11, Percy Jackson, and mind your manners. He swept into the farmhouse, Grover following him miserably. Will Grover be okay? I asked Riordan. Riordan nodded, though he looked a bit troubled. Old Dionysus isn't really mad. He just hates his job. He's been, grounded, I guess you could say, and he can't stand waiting another century before he's allowed back to Olympus. Mount Olympus? I said. You're telling me there really is a palace there? Well, now, there's Mount Olympus in Greece, and then there's the home of the gods, the convergence point of their powers, which did indeed used to be on Mount Olympus. It's still called Mount Olympus out of respect of the old ways. But the palace moves, Percy, just as the gods do. You mean the Greek gods are here? Like in America? Well, certainly. The gods move to the heart of the West. The what? Come now, Percy. What do you call Western civilization? Do you think it's an abstract concept? No, it's a living force. A collective consciousness that has burned bright for 1,000 years. The gods are a part of it. You might even say that they are the source of it. Or at least they are tied so tightly to it that they couldn't possibly fade. Not unless all of Western civilization were obliterated. The fire started in Greece. Then, as you well know, or as I hope you know since you passed my course, the heart of the fire moved to Rome. And so did the gods. Oh, different names, perhaps. Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, and so on. But the same forces, the same gods. And then they died. Died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved. To Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was brightest. The gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to do is look at their architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 3,000 years. You can see them in paintings, in statues, on the most important buildings. And yes, Percy, of course they are now in the United States. Look at your symbol, the eagle of Zeus. Look at the statue of Prometheus in Rockefeller Center. The Greek facades of your government buildings in Washington. I defy you to find any American city where the Olympians are not predominantly displayed in multiple places. Like it or not, and believe me, plenty of people weren't very fond of Rome either. America is now the heart of the flame. It is the great power of the West, and so Olympus is here, and so we are here. It was all too much, especially the fact that I seemed to be included in Riordan's we, as if I were part of some club. Who are you, Riordan? Who am I? Riordan smiled. He shifted his weight as if he were going to get up out of his wheelchair, but I knew that was impossible. He was paralyzed from the waist down. Who are you? He mused. Well, that's the question we all want answered, isn't it? But for now, we should get you to bunk in cabin 11. There will be new friends to meet, and plenty of time for lessons tomorrow. Besides, there will be s'mores at the campfire tonight. I simply adore chocolate. And then he did rise from his wheelchair, but there was something odd about the way he did it. His blanket fell away from his legs, but the legs didn't move. His waist kept getting longer, rising above his belt. At first, I thought he was wearing very long, white velvet underwear, but he kept rising out of his chair, taller than any man. I realized that the velvet underwear wasn't underwear. It was the front of an animal, muscle and sinew under coarse white fur. And the wheelchair wasn't a chair. It was some kind of container, an enormous box on wheels, and it must have been magic, because there's no way it could have held all of him. A leg came out, long and knobbly kneed, with a huge, polished hoof. Then another front leg, then hindquarters. Then the box was empty, nothing but a metal shell and a couple of fake human legs attached. I stared at the horse who had just sprung from the wheelchair, a huge white stallion. But where his neck should have been was the upper body of my Latin teacher, smoothly grafted to the horse's trunk. "What a relief," the centaur said. "I'd been cooped up in there so long, my fetlocks had fallen asleep. Now come, Percy Jackson, let's meet the other campers." All right, that was Chapter 5. I play Pinochle with a horse. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. Now let's discuss what happened. Percy is being fed some weird pudding mixture by a blonde girl who we later learn is Annabeth. What does Annabeth ask Percy about? She asks, what is this summer deadline? This, as she exactly called it, summer solstice deadline. Percy has no idea and just keeps getting spoon-fed weird popcorn-flavored pudding. What is strange about the man who is guarding Percy while he sleeps? Do you remember? He doesn't just have 2 eyes. He has eyes all over. Ooh. So they're all blue and they blink together. Why does Grover say he retrieved the Minotaur horn? So Percy can have a souvenir, I guess. All right, I want to show you this map. This is the beautiful Camp Half-Blood. There we go, that's better. So this is the house that Percy's at right now. And there's the lake he saw some people canoeing on. Lots of different things. A beautiful forest over here. And they all come up to some strawberry fields and the beach of Long Island. As Percy is looking out on this beautiful camp that we saw in this picture, what surprises him about it? I think there's a couple things. First off, he's right on the beach. Beautiful right there. Do you remember who's playing sand volleyball? It was more satyrs. So more guys who are just half goat and half person, and then other campers. There's lots of campers walking around with orange t-shirts that say Camp Half-Blood on them. We meet the camp director. His name, they call him Mr. D, but his name is Dionysus. What clues did Percy get for Mr. D's actual identity? So, at first, he doesn't know that he's the god named Dionysus, which is the god of wine. So he kind of puts some things together to figure it out. What does he do? He makes a goblet out of nothing, full of wine, and then when Riordan says, Mr. D, you're not supposed to be drinking that, he turns it into Diet Coke like it's nothing. He is also wearing a tiger print Hawaiian shirt, which back in the Greek mythology, the original Greek mythology, he always wore tiger print. So Percy put it together real quick. I would not have. So good for him. What evidence does Riordan use to prove that Greek gods are in America? He uses some different things, but one of them is our Greek architecture. So if you look, there are things like the Great Pillars, I'll bring some different examples next time, but there are lots of examples of Greek architecture in our, like, mostly Capitol buildings and things like that. Also, the American symbol is the eagle, and that is Zeus's sacred animal. According to Riordan, what is the big question that everyone wants answered? Well, Percy asked him, who am I in all of this? And so that is the question that Riordan says we all want it answered. Who is his godly parent? So, what Percy also learns is he is a demigod, or a half-blood, in which means that he is half Greek god, half human. So his dad is some Greek god, and his mom is Sally Jackson. All right, just another reminder that all of this is based on some really cool old stories called Greek mythology. They are all fiction, but really neat to learn about and to see how things have influenced, like, our architecture and all of that throughout history. I really enjoy how the author brings all of that in, and so it kind of looks like maybe it could be real, but it's not. So, we will be back with another chapter of The Lightning Thief in our next video. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you then. Bye!